Hey, what's up guys, Totallydubbed here, and today I'm doing a video review on the Lenovo P2 smartphone. That is deemed as one of the best phones for smartphone battery life, and I want to explore that. I'd like to thank GearBest for actually sending me this out for review. You can find it on their website for around £200. Prices do fluctuate between £165 and £200, so make sure you check that out. Link will be down in the description below. Now you might be wondering, what does this compare to? Now around £200 you can find the Moto G5 for around £165. In the US that is $189. You can find the Moto G4, one of the best budget smartphones, for around £150. In the US that's $160. And in the UK you can find the Vodafone Smart V8, which can be found on Vodafone's network for around £160 on pay-as-you-go. So it's not short of competitors. Now my daily driver on a daily basis is the Huawei P9. That can be found for £340, and just for the sake of comparison and the sake of showing you what a more expensive phone is capable of, I'll be using that in the comparisons. So without further ado, let's see what's inside the box, build quality and design, and obviously specs, and then we'll talk about its benchmark and performance. Now within this pretty elongated box you'll find the following. First of all, you'll get a charger, and yes, it's not a UK charger, so it's like a Chinese adapter. Now in terms of the specs of the charger, it's 5.2 volts at 2 amp, or 7 volts at 2A, so bear that in mind. It comes with a micro USB to USB cable, which would be great if my camera would focus so you guys can see. It comes with a SIM, this thing, and it comes with, quite surprisingly, an OTG adapter, which I found pretty strange but actually really handy. It's a micro USB to USB adapter, very small and very handy. It's something I actually use at university all the time to actually type up my notes on my smartphone, so you can connect up anything via this, which is compatible on Android. And of course you get the smartphone itself with my swanky little wallpaper in the background. Now in terms of the smartphone's build quality, it's actually really good. You've got a on the right hand side you've got a power button and a volume rocker. At the top you've got a 3.5mm headphone jack. Yes, take note Apple. You've got the SIM card tray on the left hand side. You've got a little toggle of switch. Now the toggle switch over here, basically what this does, it enables like a super saving battery mode. That is pretty much like a switch of emergency, saying, hey, I really need to keep my phone's basic functionalities, I need to toggle a switch, and Lenovo have included that. That's a really nice little touch over here. Unfortunately, that cannot be customized to anything else, but given the fact we're talking about smartphone and battery life, it's really cool that they've included that. At the bottom, you've got a right downward fired facing speaker, a micro USB input over here for charging and data transfers or whatever you might need. At the back you've got a single camera with a flash, and you've got NFC capabilities as well, which is great in order for pairing. Now at the front you've got no capacitive buttons, however you've got a fingerprint sensor embedded within the home button, which is great. It unlocks relatively quick, I must say. It doesn't work all the time, but most of the time it unlocks pretty quickly. Now let's talk about specs. Now within the P2, and thank you for GSM Arena for providing the info, the links will be in the description below to their website. It has a full HD 1080p display, so that's 1920 by 1080p. It has a 401 ppi pixel density, which is enough for scrolling text and looking at images on your smartphone. It's got a 5.5-inch display, so do bear that in mind. It has a Qualcomm Snapdragon 625, which is very much fast, and I'll share my benchmark data in just a bit. Which is an octa-core 2 GHz Cortez A53 chip. It has a GPU of Adreno 506, enough for light gaming such as Temple Run, Pokemon Go and whatnot, but don't expect to play Asphalt 8 for example on it, because it simply won't work. In terms of its Android version, it comes shipped with Android 6.0.1, however it can be upgraded to Android 7.0, which is fantastic. In terms of SD card slots, it takes a micro SD card up to 256 gigabytes. That uses SIM slot 2, and yes, it's got two. It's a dual SIM design, which means that you can use a nano SIM and a a micro SD card at the same time. Nevertheless, in terms of the internal storage, you've got 32 gigabytes of storage with enough RAM, which is about 3 gigabytes of RAM to power you through it. Other than that, at the back you've got a 13 megapixel camera with f2.0 aperture, and I'll get into my camera test in just a bit and how it does. At the front you've got a 5 megapixel front shooter, a selfie camera so to speak, and in terms of video you can shoot up to 30 FPS at 1080p with its rear facing camera. And the front one as well shoots at 1080p and has got an aperture of f2.2. Other than that, in terms of Bluetooth connectivity, it's got Bluetooth 4.1, it's got Wi-Fi, which is pretty much standard, but it's got Wi-Fi A, B, G, N, and AC, which is also dual band, which is quite nice to see in a phone which is around £200, not something that you'd normally see. Other than that, the micro USB connection is a 2.0 connection, which is to be expected. And if there's any other specs that I might have missed, make sure you check them down in the description below to GSM Arena's website. One final thing I should mention, it's got a non-removable 5100 milliamp battery, and I'll get into that in just a second. So now, how does it do in terms of its performance? Now, in terms of performance, the everyday usage, I've had absolutely no problems. Now, I usually play Pokemon Go on a daily basis, and playing Pokemon Go and scrolling through my different various apps or multitasking, I had absolutely no problems with that. It's processor and GPU work flawlessly, and coupled with the amount of RAM that you've got in there, you're not going to have many problems. Now over here you'll be able to see a Geekbench 4 benchmark. That was a single core and multi-core performance. I've compared it to some of the phones that I mentioned previously at the beginning of this review, and you can see how the Lenovo P2 stacks. It stacks really well, and it does relatively good. Against the P9, obviously it's going to lose out, but in comparison to other budget phones, it's actually right up there. In terms of GFX Bench Manhattan 3.0, this basically is a pretty hardcore benchmark for GPUs, as in mobile GPUs, and you can see there the phone actually does relatively well at 10 FPS or with on-screen and the off-screen, which is identical for 10 FPS. You can see it just edges slightly above its competitors, but again, don't really expect to be gaming really hardcore games on there. Simple games such as Pokemon Go will work, but anything above that, it might be a little bit of a problem. So here we go, playing some Pokemon Go, just going to try and randomly catch a Pokemon. Now, the reason I used Pokemon Go as a prime example is simply because of its battery life. Now, the battery life of this phone is absolutely sensational, and while I try and catch this Pokemon, I just want to talk about how good the battery life is. Now, in comparison to other phones out there, which probably last around, in terms of average day of usage, they'll last about 1 day, if not half a day in terms of your usage. Now, in this respect, the Lenovo P2 lasts well above 2 to 3 days of medium to heavy usage, and that's quite a lot given to my standards. Because of someone who plays Pokemon Go, let's just say this phone will last you 2 days worth of not solid Pokemon Go, but quite a lot amount of Pokemon Go, and that is very impressive. I haven't noticed that on any flagship phone, I haven't noticed that on any phones that compete with it, and I must say, in terms of overall performance and battery life, this phone really does match everything that you'd expect it to do. So, just generally speaking, for performance-wise, it's great, it does the job. It's not going to compete with flagship smartphones out there with Snapdragon 835s like in the Galaxy S8 or be an iPhone 8 or iPhone 7 equivalent. However, given what most people will use their phones for, such as Pokemon Go, such as Temple Run, or such as Candy Crush, this phone is absolutely flawless for that. And its battery life is unbeaten by any smartphone in the world from any manufacturer. It's that good, especially with its switch over here, allowing you to really extend that battery life. Say, for example, you're going to go camping or something. It is really good. So for Pokemon Go players like myself, this is the best phone that you could potentially buy because it does exactly what you need on the tin. Now, what about its display? So you can see over here the display, probably my camera's not picking up an accurate display of how it looks like, but the display itself is actually really nice. It might not be perfect, again, in comparison to other flagship phones out there, but in comparison to other budget phones, I found that, generally speaking, the display was good. It's got good viewing angles. In terms of the brightness, it's bright enough to be seen under the sunlit conditions, and in terms of its color accuracy, it's not perfect, but again, it does the job in terms of portraying how these apps should look like, or how colors within apps should be. Finally, to round up the performance side of it, I want to talk about its software. Now, it comes with Android 7.0, well, which is upgraded to 7.0 for free, and I must say it works flawlessly. It's butterly smooth. I didn't have any sort of problems or any lags or jitters, and on top of that, it looks like pretty much stock Android, other than the fact that you've got the Lenovo launcher, which is installed by default, but you can easily change that via the Play Store and install any launcher to your heart's content. I like that because there's very little bloatware to be seen, and other than a few default apps such as Share It or some of the theme centers of the and Sync It, which are the default apps on most Lenovo devices, all the rest of them are installed by myself or are default by Google, such as Google Maps and Google Photos and whatnot. So overall, great experience there. Finally, let's talk about its camera performance. Now, to test its camera performance, I went around in London and took about a few test shots. What I did over here is try to test it versus the Huawei P9. Now, obviously, as I said before, the Huawei P9 is not a fair comparison, to say the least. However, you'll be able to see over here a few comparison shots. I took them with HDR on and HDR off. Now, the differences were pretty obvious. The Huawei P9 picks up a lot more lifelike colors versus the P2, and in terms of the detail that it draws, the P9 was able to draw a lot more detail than the P2 was able to do so. You'll be able to see over here as well now some low light photography, which is what Buckingham Palace, great place, and playing Pokemon over there. You'll be able to see here again that the P9 really does perform a lot better. It's got a little less image noise, but yet picks up a lot more detail than the P2 was able to do so. Moving around, I also noticed that the color accuracy was more accurate, it was more lifelike, and colors weren't oversaturated of any sorts, which you might be able to see in a few pictures over here, which I'm going through. Finally, in terms of indoor shots, in terms of highlighting, really good lighting, you see my favorite little chimp over there. Again, colors were a lot more accurate on the P9 than they were on the P2. And in terms of flash photography, again, the P9 portrayed it a little bit better, but nevertheless, the P2 does a very good job, given the fact that we're talking about a budget smartphone here. In terms of outdoor photography with HDR and HDR off, again the P9 performed fantastically, especially with HDR, where you can see great amount of cloud detail on the top left hand side, and especially with the trees on the bottom. In the versus the P2, it kind of merges it a little bit, improves a little bit of a detail via HDR, but other than that, it's still a relatively okay-ish picture. So in other words, the camera at the back of the smartphone is good enough for a budget smartphone, but it doesn't compete with other phones out there, especially in terms of like flagship phones. Then it is completely and utterly destroyed versus them. But again, they do cost a lot more, so you have to bear that in mind. Versus its competitors, I must say it does very well versus the G4 and the G5, which is its direct competitors, and versus the Vodafone Smart V8, I think it still does an amazing job, if not does a little bit of a better job. So overall, I would say the camera is great, but make sure you are expecting a budget experience rather than something that's a bit more premium. So would I recommend the Lenovo P2? For £200 or a little bit less, or even a little bit more, given the fact you have to pay import fees or whatever it might be, the Lenovo P2 is a sensational phone. Its only problem is it's a little bit hard to source. By that I mean only GearBest, as far as I could tell, really sourced the phone. Other than that, there's really no sort of disadvantages of the smartphone at its given price. It is one of the best smartphones out there, and Given the fact of its battery life and how well it does, I must say it is an absolutely recommended phone by me. It's one of the best phones I've ever come across, and something that I must say that if you're a Pokemon Go player, for example, or if you're someone who's looking for a good battery life in a phone, like the Nokia 3310 days, the Lenovo P2 does the job. Alright guys, make sure you give this a like, comment, subscribe, let me know in the comments below what you think is the best budget smartphone, or a small phone that can really beat the P2 given its price. And other than that guys, take it easy and enjoy. Bye bye.